we are pleased today to have a neighbor as our speaker. But before I introduce Bob Stone, I'd like to tell you that we are still in the process of rounding out our speaker schedule for this year. If you go to our website, you will see details on our March program, our April program, and our May program. We do have a commitment from John Hennessy of the National Park Service to either have himself or one of his fellow historians do our February program. We'll put that information in the website as soon as we have that information. So please continue to revisit the website, and we'll definitely send out a blast email like 2 weeks before so that you can set that on your schedule. So with that, I will turn it back to Robert Johnson. Oh, that's right. Well, I'm sorry. Minor detail. Our guest speaker is Bob Stone. He is a graduate of West Virginia University. He's a lifelong educator. Since his retirement, he has spent a good deal of time teaching people that are very much wanting to learn, i.e. adult students, in a variety of programs through, correct me if I'm wrong, the Fairfax County school system?
Arlington County.
Arlington, pardon me. Okay, Arlington school system.
Not part of the school system. It's a private Encore learning group.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, in any rate, it is adult learning. So it's very, very motivated students, and that's got to be a joy to step into that role and talk about that. Educate them as they want to be educated. Well, anyway, with that, I'll turn it back to Bob Johnson, who has a few housekeeping issues, and then we will proceed with the program.
Well, as you can see from my slide, I assume it's displaying. We've had the information from Charles. I'm going to mute everyone just to be sure that you don't speak out or your dogs bark. We probably should disable your video to cut down on distractions from Bob's presentation. And for questions, there's a little box called chat on your Zoom screen down at the bottom. If you'll type in your comment or your chat, we'll try to cover those afterwards. If you have information to put in, like a new website, go ahead and put that in. So without further ado, here should be Bob. Bob, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. All right. Well, if you know, the topic today is West Virginia, the road to statehood. It's going to be 2 parts. The first part is just going to give the facts about what happened and how it happened.
Whoops, Bob, I muted you. Bob?
All right.
There you go. Sorry.
Start all over again?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the topic today is West Virginia, the road to statehood. It's going to be told in 2 parts. One would be the facts of how West Virginia became a state, and the second part will be the legalities of that, those facts. Most people know that the state of West Virginia was founded in the middle of the Civil War. The birth date is June 20th, 1863. And that's only a week and a half before the Battle of Gettysburg. So without further ado, as Paul Harvey used to say, here's the rest of the story. Yep, my slides aren't working. There we go. All right, well, this is a painting of King Charles II. He started all of this. What is now part of West Virginia was originally part of the King Charles II 1649 grant of 5.2 million acres to the father of Thomas Fairfax, who would become the sixth Lord of Fairfax of Cameron. This is Thomas, the sixth Lord of Fairfax. He's the son of the man that was given this land by the king. And Thomas took ownership of the granted land in 1716. The grant covered all of the land between the Potomac River and the Rappahannock River from their source. Whoops. Go back. Here, Potomac River and all the way up to its source, and the Rappahannock River up to its source, 5.2 million acres. In 1746, a large stone called the Fairfax Stone was placed at the intersection of Preston, Grant, and Tucker counties, now all in West Virginia, to mark the western boundary of the Lord Fairfax's grant. During the 1750s, more immigrants crossed the mountains into West Virginia, but their journey was often impeded by conflicts with the Native American peoples and the rugged terrain. An even larger number of immigrants moved into Western Virginia following the American Revolution, including Scots-Irish and more Germans. Now, the first major settlement was called New Mecklenburg on the upper Potomac River, and it was settled by Germans. Today, we know it as Shepherdstown. By the end of the 1700s, small towns had sprung up in what today is known as the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia, Morgan, Berkeley, Jefferson counties. Settlements further west were slower to form, mainly because of the continuing resistance of the Native American peoples and the land disputes that took years to settle in court. Now, this is going to look strange. That's the way it actually came out of the book. Didn't have it very good directions in whoever put that map together, but in the 1790 census showed that there were 750,000 whites living in Eastern Virginia counties, but only 55,000 living in what are the Western counties. So Western counties only accounted for 7% of the state's population. However, the percentage in the Western counties would more than double in the 1820 census to 181,000 and would double again in the 1860 census to 532,000. And so that would become 33% of the population of the whole state of Virginia. Now, this is a hard map to read, but the thing here is the black areas or dark areas are where most of the slaves were. And that means that they were in Eastern Virginia and not in Western Virginia. The 1860 census showed that slaves in the eastern portion were 480,000, which is the highest in the South, by the way, as opposed to the western portion, which only had 17,600 slaves. Only one county in what is now West Virginia, that's Jefferson County, had a large percentage of slaves, over 25% in that census. Now, this gentleman was writing books about Ohio in the 1840s, and he decided to go into Western Virginia and publish something about Western Virginia. And he called it the Historical Collections of Virginia. In this book, he pointed out that Eastern Virginians owned plantations, used slave labor, and relied on the rivers, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Atlantic Ocean for their commerce. And that commerce was mostly tobacco. In contrast, the Western Virginians had small subsistence farms. They did not use slave labor except in certain areas, and they tended to trade to the west on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Mr. Howe appears to be the first writer to define Eastern Virginians as planters and Western Virginians as mountaineers, while recognizing that their differences were social, political, and economic. Now, here's the man that caused the big problem, George Mason. He wrote the first Virginia Constitution in 1776, and it was ratified by a constitutional convention of delegates, but it was not subject to the approval of voters across the state. The most critical provision affecting the western part of the Virginia was the clause that gave voting rights only to white men who owned at least 25 acres of improved land or at least 50 acres of unimproved land. And very few men in Western Virginia met that criteria. So in the General Assembly, the Western counties had very small contingent. They could never get any legislation passed. So this is where the first discord appeared. It was long before the Civil War. As Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia, written in 1784, said that the concentration of arbitrary power in the legislature would ignore the minority's, quote, Western Virginia wishes. Now, this is the first complaint from Western Virginia came in 1803 in a letter written to the Richmond Examiner newspaper. The letter was signed by John G. Jackson, a delegate to the General Assembly from Harrison County, the Clarksburg area. And he wrote underneath his name, a mountaineer. In the letter, Jackson said that also, although Western Virginians paid property taxes on their land, they had virtually no voting rights. Jackson reasoned that the Virginia Constitution actually violated the Declaration of Independence because it constituted taxation without representation. Jackson would go on to serve in the US Congress and later become a US district judge. And by the way, he was a distant relative of Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, a Western Virginian. Thomas Jefferson was the first Eastern Virginian to propose a remedy to the inequality between the two sections. In 1816, Jefferson proposed legislative representation be based on white male population, that all free white men be given voting privileges regardless of land ownership, and that all state and local offices should be subject to elections by popular vote. Up to this time, the General Assembly always selected the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, and all the US senators. So this would be a big change. The delegates from Western Virginia met in Stanton in the Shenandoah Valley to discuss Jefferson's proposals, and these men could not reach an agreement on a long-term solution to this problem. Even without any recommendations coming from West Virginia representatives, the 1816 Virginia General Assembly did pass new legislation that was mostly favorable to the Western counties. The Western region received greater representation with reapportionment now based on white male population. In addition, the legislature set up a board of public works with the charge to develop and expand roads and canal systems in Western Virginia, something that was really badly needed. Although passed with changes made, Western Virginians were upset that the voting rights were still tied to land ownership. Virginia was one of only 2 states that held the opinion regarding land ownership as a prerequisite for voting. In addition, Virginia still based its representation in the General Assembly on counties rather than on populations. Since Eastern Virginia had more than double the number of counties that were in Western Virginia, the East would always maintain a stranglehold on legislation. Not satisfied with the gains in 1816, after stewing for a while, Western Virginia's representatives called for a constitutional convention in 1829. They sought the vote for all free white males equal representation based on white male population, and direct elections by popular vote of all local and state officials. The Constitutional Convention opened October 5th of 1829, with many of Virginia's famous sons attending, including John Tyler, John Marshall, James Monroe, and James Madison. However, of the 96 delegates to the convention, only 18 were from Western counties. And the 1820 census had established that the Western counties amounted to 33% of Virginia's population, but they only got 19% of the delegates. Not surprisingly, all three of the agenda items that were requested by the Western delegates were quickly defeated. The convention dragged on for 4 months and did recommend substantial changes to the Constitution, but none of those recommendations would help Western Virginians. The constitutional changes recommended by the convention had to go to a popular vote of eligible voters throughout the Commonwealth. These changes were approved in April 1830, but the vote showed the deep divide between East and West. Easterners approved the changes by 55% to 45%. Westerners disapproved the changes by 86% against 14%. The Kanawha Republic newspaper almost immediately called for secession of Western Virginia from Virginia. And this is in 1831, so it's 30 years before the Civil War. The Wheeling Gazette newspaper called for delegates to meet, quote, with the Eastern nabobs for a division of the state, peaceably if can, forcibly if must. I had to look up the definition of nabobs, Britishers returning rich from India. The leader of the Lindsay Institute in New Jersey, Thomas L. Lees, wrote in 1831 about the situation in Virginia. He said, quote, that part of Virginia which borders on the Ohio is rapidly improving in wealth and population. Its inhabitants have long been dissatisfied with the selfish policies and the usurpations of the Eastern slave owners, whose influence in the legislative body has been ever exerted in the perpetration of an oppressive aristocracy. The people here are very different from those of the eastern part of the state. Industry is much more encouraged and respected. Slavery is unpopular, and a few that hold slaves generally treat them well. The time is not too far distant when West Virginia will either liberalize the state government or separate itself entirely from the Old Dominion. Again, this was printed in 1831. Now, also in 1831, you had the Nate Turner Slave Rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, resulting in the massacre of 50 whites before the rebellion was stopped. Turner was able to elude capture for more than 2 months, and this set off widespread fear amongst the white population. Militia and vigilante mobs roamed the Commonwealth, rounding up blacks without regard to whether they had participated in the rebellion or not. By the time that Turner was captured, you see an illustration of this, these militia and vigilante mobs had executed more than 100 blacks. The Virginia legislature and many other southern state legislatures quickly passed harsher laws prohibiting blacks from learning how to read and write, taking away their freedom to assemble. The laws also prohibited blacks from having separate church services unless a white minister supervised the gathering. And then the federal fugitive slave laws were enacted in this year. Here's William Lloyd Garrison, an avowed abolitionist. Nate Turner's actions gave him the cover to come out in the open. The famous journalist started publishing his newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831. Many residents of Western Virginia became abolitionists because they felt that slaves were taking away jobs from whites. Henry Ruffner, then president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, made a speech at Franklin Society arguing against slavery in the Trans-Allegheny area of Virginia. Ruffner himself was a slave owner and the son of a Kanawha Valley salt industrialist. By 1840, many Western leaders felt that there was a greater need for expansion of the railroads through the state. The canal and road projects that had been approved by the state legislature in 1816 had not been a success. And now that railroads were the latest things, Western Virginia wanted them to come through their region. This is a map of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that's running through most of West Virginia here to go into Ohio. On November 5th, 1842, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had reached Cumberland, Maryland, en route to the Ohio River. A competition ensued between Parkersburg and Wheeling, Virginia, both wanting to be the road's westernmost terminus. The Virginia General Assembly made the choice of Wheeling in 1847 and directed that the railroad go through Grafton and Fairmont on the way to Wheeling. However, Parkersburg was not left out, as the General Assembly gave Northwestern Virginia Railroad permission to run a line from the Baltimore and Ohio terminal at Grafton to Parkersburg. This 100-mile line was completed in 1857. And by this time, the Baltimore and Ohio Rail Company had already purchased the stock of the Western Virginia Company. So in fact, they owned all of it. This line today is a rail bike trail. During the period from 1829 Constitutional Convention, Western Virginia leaders had been calling for another convention to help solve many of their problems. Finally, on March 4th, 1850, the General Assembly approved a new convention bill. So you see, it took 21 years for the legislature to give up a new constitutional convention. The third, or they called it the Reform Constitutional Convention, convened in Richmond on October 14th, 1850. The delegates haggled for 9 months over such things as taxation, internal improvements, land assessments, literacy, and the state's liabilities and debts. When the convention finally ended, the major victory for Western Virginians came with the reform in the requirements for voting. The land ownership requirement was changed so that all white men who lived in the state for at least 2 years or at least 21 years of age could now vote. In addition, the people would now vote for judges and governors and the other state officials. Now, Waitman Willie was the leader here of the Western Virginia contingent at that convention. It was approved, the convention was approved by a vote of 75,000 to 11,000, or 87% to 13%. Several new faces came who had not been around at the last convention in 1829. And one of these men was Waitman Willie from Morgantown, who would go on to become the first US Senator from the new state of West Virginia. And as an aside, I lived on Willie Avenue in Morgantown because they named his street after him. Now, another new face that was at that Richmond convention was Joseph Johnson. Previous, all 31 governors of Virginia, previous ones, had come from Eastern Virginia. There had never been a governor from the Western section. Joseph Johnson broke that, and he was from Bridgeport, Virginia, which of course is in West Virginia now. He was elected governor of Virginia in 1852. He was born in New York, but moved into Western Virginia in late 1700s. He fought in the War of 1812, and he served in the US Congress for 14 years. Johnson was an avowed abolitionist, in spite of the fact that he owned slaves. He held that blacks should receive equal protection under the laws of the Commonwealth, and he condemned the fugitive slave laws. In his first message to the General Assembly, Governor Johnson called for the completion of the James River and Kanawha Canal and the extension of the Central Railroad through the Kanawha Valley. These recommendations were approved by the Assembly. A little Civil War aside, Governor Johnson was the man that pardoned a young University of Virginia student by the name of John Singleton Mosby after he had served 1 year for a non-fatal shooting on the University of Virginia campus. Now, unfortunately for Governor Johnson, the world economic crisis called the Panic of 1857 occurred during his tenure in the State House. In Western Virginia, the salt industry in the Kanawha Valley went bankrupt and other factories and mills shut down, causing large-scale unemployment. And then came this man, Roger B. Tawney and Dred Scott, another major event taking place in that time period. In the case that blacks were inferior to whites, and that they had no rights, that white men need respect. I see they're taking down the statue of Roger B. Tawney in Maryland. This is John Brown. Not long after this, in 1859, John Brown and his radical abolitionists took over the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry on August 16th, 1859, hoping to arm the slaves from the surrounding countryside. After a 2-day standoff, federal troops under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee and with the assistance of First Lieutenant James Ewell Brown Stewart captured John Brown and his men. Brown and his men were convicted of treason in the Jefferson County Courthouse and hung in Charlestown in December 1859. Although this event did not affect the entire state, it certainly brought militia units from the nearby counties to both Harpers Ferry and Charlestown. In fact, there were more Virginia troops massed in that part of the state for the John Brown incident than at the Battle of Yorktown in the Revolutionary War. It also scared Virginians who did not sleep well, thinking about the possibilities of a slave revolt. Then we get to the 1860 election, where they have 4 candidates. Of course, Abraham Lincoln won the election November 6, 1860, but he only got 39.8% of the national vote. His election was certified by the Electoral College on February 13, 1861. In Virginia, Lincoln only received a total of 1,887 votes, but 1,402 of those came from the western counties. The western counties slightly favored John C. Breckinridge, while the eastern counties slightly favored John Bell. With Lincoln's victory, many Virginians began to focus on the possibility of secession. In the 1860 census, Virginia had the greatest number of slaves in the South, now up to 490,865, and the feeling was that Lincoln and his administration would be trying to limit and or eliminate slavery across the South. Now, this is John Letcher, who is the Virginia governor during the Civil War. In his State of the Union message, spoke about the secession of South Carolina and how that might affect Virginia. He urged restraint and asked Virginians to do everything in their power to help avert a war. Letcher sent Virginia Judge John Robertson to South Carolina with suggestions for reaching a compromise with the federal government. The Crittenden resolutions were the basis of Robertson's suggestions. As a peace commissioner, Robertson was treated very coldly and sent on his way home. The Charleston Mercury, which was the leading newspaper in the South, commented that Virginians could no longer be trusted friends of the Deep South. After Robertson returned to Richmond with the bad news for Governor Letcher, the states of New York, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee sent resolutions to Virginia saying, in effect, that those states did not condone Virginia's actions. These resolutions from other states widened the gulf between Virginia and northern states. In February of 1861, Virginia held its first secession convention at Mechanics Institute in Richmond. Delegates were chosen by their individual counties based on their political stands. Most of the delegates selected were pro-union. The topic of secession was hotly debated for more than a month by the 152 delegates, with most of the delegates leaning towards compromise rather than breaking from the Union. There was even hope that Virginia could be the leader in healing the divide between North and South. Jubal Early, a lawyer from Rocky Mount, was one of the convention's staunchest Union supporters. He insisted, quote, "The enthusiasm for secession is short-sighted and likely to lead to war." Early thought that the voices of the Southerners who did not own slaves, which was the majority of Southerners, were just as worthy of protection as the right of those who did own slaves. Of course, Jubal Early became one of the best generals in the Confederacy. Now, this Henry Wise was the governor before Letcher. Wakeman T. Willie, the lawyer from Morgantown that we've seen before, reminded delegates of the long-standing disparity between the rights of Eastern Virginia slave owners and the West Virginia mountaineers. Former Virginia Governor Henry Wise, a radical secessionist, brought protesters to the city in an attempt to strong-arm the delegates into voting for pro-South. When the vote was finally held on April 4th, 1861, the ordinance of secession was soundly defeated by a vote of 90 to 45. When the vote was announced, staunch Whig John Jenney cheered and said, quote, "The secessionists are now without the slightest hope of success." Well, hope returned on April 12th, 1861, when South Carolina forces fired on Union Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. This action forced President Lincoln on April 15th to call for 75,000 troops from the states for 90 days. Virginia's quota was 2,340 militiamen, but Governor John Letcher's answer to President Lincoln was, quote, "I have only to say that the militia of Virginia will not be furnished to the powers at Washington for any such use or purpose as they have in view. Your object is to subjugate the southern states, and you have chosen to inaugurate a civil war." And Lincoln's call for troops on April 15th changed the stance of many Virginia secession delegates. In addition, representatives from Mississippi, South Carolina, and Georgia arrived at the convention to tell the Virginians that they may be in grave danger if they continued to side with the federal government. Western Virginian John Jackson, who you met, predicted prior to another vote that, quote, "If the state of Virginia secedes from the Union, as sure as there is God in heaven, Northwestern Virginia will secede from the state of Virginia." On April 17th, the convention voted in secret session, and this time the vote was 88 in favor of secession, 55 against. Of the 55 who voted against secession, only 2 of those votes came from Eastern Virginia. Those in opposition to secession were from the Ohio Valley counties of Northwestern Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, and the Potomac River Valley. Except for the Shenandoah Valley, this is what the area of West Virginia is now. When the vote to secede was announced, former Governor Henry Wise, personally, without authority, gave the orders to state militia to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry and the Navy Yard at Hampton Roads. At convention, Wise had brandished a revolver and pledged, quote, "Blood will be flowing at Harper's Ferry before night." Governor John Letcher had no knowledge that Wise was going to order these actions. Of course, when they got there, the Federals had already evacuated and the arsenal was burning. Now, another man who's big in West Virginia history was John Carlisle. The Western Virginia delegate of Clarksburg walked out of the convention, vowing at the time to form a new state government loyal to the Union. A number of Union supporters at the convention were threatened with personal violence on account of their opposition to the secession vote. They left Richmond and returned to their homes. The secession ordinance was not binding until passed by the state's eligible voters, white males at least 21 years old and having lived in Virginia for at least 2 years. On May 23rd, 1861, The ordinance was voted on, and the result was announced on June 25th. The ordinance passed by a vote of 132,201 in favor of to 37,451 against, which is a 78% favor. But in the western counties, the vote was opposite, 29,900 against and 14,937 in favor of secession. So 67% of the voters in Western Virginia opposed secession. Now this, for some reason or other, I couldn't get this arrow off when I took the picture off the net. But this is Archibald Campbell. After the second convention vote to secede from the Union, the editor of the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, which was one of the bigger newspapers in Western Virginia, Archibald W. Campbell, said in an editorial that the secession vote was a mockery of the wishes of the people and said the state was now in revolution. He wanted the federal government to aid and protect Western counties before the, quote, despoilers and traitors in their wild fury are turning the eastern part of our state into a vast field of anarchy. Sounds like a newspaper. Can do the same thing in Western Virginia. His editorial also urged Western Virginia men to enroll in the Union Army. Now, this is the West Virginia Independence Hall, or site of the Wheeling Convention. So Western Virginia leaders met on April 22nd, 1861, with over 1,000 supporters outside the courthouse. Resolutions were adopted calling for a convention of the people to be held in Wheeling. The first Wheeling Convention was held May 13th to May 15th, 1861, with 429 delegates showing up from the Western counties. The only official action taken at the first convention was to establish the rules for selecting the delegates for the second Wheeling Convention in the expectation that the popular vote on secession would pass, and they actually did. The second Wheeling Convention was held June 11th to June 25th, 1861, in Washington Hall, now called the Custom House. Arthur Borman was elected convention chair. Note, Mr. Borman would become the very first official governor of West Virginia, on June 20th, 1863. 87 delegates from 32 counties were seated after they were required to take an oath to support the Constitution of the United States and, quote, the restored and reorganized government of Virginia. And that's very important, and I'll get to it in just a little bit. Now, the man who's called the father of West Virginia is this gentleman, Francis Pierpont. On June 20th, 1861, the convention delegates agreed to form a, quote, restored and reorganized government of Virginia. Francis H. Pierpont of Marion County was elected the governor. The new government was to take effect on July 1, 1861, and the capital was being Wheeling. The reason that the convention did not propose to form a new state from the beginning was to satisfy the Union constitutional process for the creation of a new state from within the boundaries of an existing state. So the restored and reorganized government immediately set upon the task of reestablishing government functions for Virginia at the federal, state, and county and local level. They called upon President Lincoln to provide military aid, and he announced that General George McClellan was the official military representative of the federal government in Virginia. The new legislature assembled on July 1, 1861, and quickly elected new U.S. senators and members of the House of Representatives. And these representatives were accepted by the United States Congress and the United States Senate, and House of Representatives. So they became the official government of Virginia. Now, this is a map of what's proposed as the new state. Governor Pierpont sent a letter including a proposed map to President Lincoln, making an official application for recognition of a newly formed state by both President and the U.S. Congress. On June 25th, a response to Pierpont's request was received in Wheeling from Secretary of War Simon Cameron, writing for the president. This letter not only gave the new government of Virginia much needed military aid, but the federal government had also informally recognized the new state government. On July 1, 1861, the new state legislature was called into session. They set up a constitutional convention for the fall of 1861, where the delegates would write a new state constitution for Virginia. One of their main concerns was how to comply with the fact that U.S. Constitution, Article 4, Section 3, forbade the formation of a new state from within the bounds of an existing state without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as the Congress. The new legislature of the restored and reorganized state also dealt with some problems related to the monies that had been appropriated for the old Virginia legislature for capital improvements in Western Virginia. Two examples were the work on the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, in Lewis County, and the loan for the building of the West Liberty Academy in Ohio County. The restored and reorganized government seized $27,000 in gold from the old Virginia government bank account at a Western bank and used these funds to finish the two projects. The new legislature also selected the state representatives to the U.S. Congress. To replace the old Virginia senators of R.M.T. Hunter and James Mason, the legislature selected John S. Carlisle and Whitman Wiley to fill the vacant seats. The new House representatives were selected were Kellen Whaley, William Brown, and Jacob Blair. Both the new senators and the new House representatives were accepted into the U.S. Congress in mid-July of 1861. The next step for the legislature was to distance themselves from the former state of Virginia, both symbolically and legally. They voted to render null and void every resolution approved by the Virginia Secession Convention, and then they took on the statehood debate in earnest. Now, I will point out that there were other states, such as Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, that had two sets of governments. One was a Confederate set and one was a Union set. So Virginia is not unique in that. Many of the delegates were unsure of the path to take, but John Carlisle was not among them. He told his colleagues that they needed to, quote, cut the knot now. He argued that regardless of the outcome of the war, Western Virginia needed to take care of its own future. Carlisle's impassioned plea brought an agreement that the creation of a new state with a new constitution was the goal of this new legislature. They authorized a new constitutional convention to which delegates would be elected on October 24th, 1861, if the popular vote confirmed support for the new state. The federal government's policies continued to favor the newly formed government. In August of 1861, when President Lincoln made trade with the rebel states illegal, he exempted those parts of Virginia lying west of the Allegheny Mountains. That same month, U.S. Attorney General Edward Bates gave his legal opinion on the formation of the restored and reorganized government of Virginia, and he wrote, "He rejoiced in the movement in Western Virginia as a legal, constitutional, and safe refuge from revolution and anarchy." So the United States Attorney General approved the operation. So now we had a new set of maps made. The light yellow is going to be the regular Virginia, and this yellow is the map original, and now they're going to add these counties onto it, except for Jefferson County and Berkeley County. That would be added 1 month after the passing of the approval of the state. Delegates then debated the boundaries of the new state. Following the debate, the counties of Pocahontas, Greenbrier, that's these counties here, all the way up, Mercer, Monroe, McDowell, they were all added to the official state map. In addition, the delegates were willing to add other counties if the citizens in those counties favored statehood. Invitations to join the new state went out to Jefferson, Berkeley, Frederick, Morgan, Hampshire, Hardy, and Pendleton counties. And every one of these counties voted to join the new state, except for Frederick County, which is where Winchester is located. In the fall of 1861, arms and ammunition started arriving in Western Virginia from the federal government. President Lincoln's secretary, John Hay, would write in his diary about this event saying, quote, "The loyalty will be safer in Western Virginia than rebellion will be in the eastern slopes of the Blue Ridge." However, the new state government was having a difficult time raising the 2,340-man quota of volunteers that the Union Army called for. Now, I'll tell you that by war's end, it was probably almost equal. Between 22 and 25,000 soldiers went north from Western Virginia, and about the same number went south. The Wellsburg Herald wrote an editorial about the shortage of volunteer troops. Quote, "A pretty condition Northwestern Virginia is in to establish herself as a separate state. After all the drumming and all the gas about a separate state, she's actually organized in the field 4 not entire regiments of soldiers, and one of these hails almost entirely from the northern panhandle." The federal government was not concerned about the lack of sufficient volunteer soldiers coming from Western Virginia, because they were more concerned about the strategic position of the region, with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad critical to transporting Union supplies. They crossed 200 miles, through northern Western Virginia. The Ohio River, the western boundary of the Western Virginia, was important for transportation, and Western Virginia's addition to the Union would also symbolically important as action for a border state. The voters of the restored and reorganized state of Virginia approved supporting a new state by a wide margin, 18,408 in favor to 781 opposed. But the results raised a lot of controversy because only 30% of the eligible voters went to the polls. In several counties, less than 10% of the voters cast a ballot. And in 13 counties, no ballots were submitted. Even with this voter controversy, the first Constitutional Convention was approved to start on November 26, 1861. One of the biggest issues with the Constitutional Convention delegates was the subject of slavery in the new state. The representatives knew they needed a compromise position because the U.S. Congress was not going to allow a pro-slavery state into the Union. The Reverend Gordon Battelle, who you see here of Ohio County, made a simple proposal, quote, "No slave shall be brought or free person of color be permitted to come into this state for permanent residence." Another big issue was the naming of the new state. The western part of Virginia had long been called the Kanawha District, with that title showing on several official maps. So this was the expected favorite name for the delegates. However, after long discussions, West Virginia was adopted by a vote of 30 in favor and 14 against. Only 9 of the delegates actually voted for Kanawha. On February 18th, 1862, the state constitution was unanimously approved by the delegates. This constitution was then presented to the citizens for a vote, and it was approved 18,862 in favor and 514 opposed. U.S. Senator John Carlisle was given the job of presenting the statehood bills in Washington, where it was hoped that they would quickly get approval. As the statehood question was presented to the U.S. Congress, there was a split between North and South within the new state of West Virginia. Some counties were just having second thoughts. Some counties didn't want to enter into a union as a free state in regards to slavery. And some counties were angered by the Northern West Virginia delegates' refusal to approve Southern West Virginia Railroad through Kanawha Valley. In the congressional hearings on the West Virginia statehood, the question arose: the West Virginia delegates were going to get permission of the Virginia delegates as required by the Constitution. This was solved by having the restored and reorganized government of Virginia, replacing the Confederate government, grant itself permission to form a new state. That pronouncement remains as controversial today as it was in May of 1862, and that will be the ending of my talk this morning. In President Lincoln's cabinet, Secretary of War Edward Stanton asked the president to request the West Virginia delegates that the eastern panhandle counties of Jefferson and Berkeley be added to the new state to protect the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that ran through those two counties. This action would be accomplished on July 20th, 1863, 1 month after the official West Virginia state. The path to statehood did not go as smoothly as West Virginia delegates wanted. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, the famed anti-slavery politician, demanded that the new state constitution free all the slaves. After some heated conversations, Senator Waitman Willey of the restored and reorganized Virginia government proposed an amendment which became known as the Willey Amendment. And it read, quote, "The children of slaves born within the limits of this state after the 4th day of July, 1863, shall be free. And all slaves within said state who shall at the time aforesaid be under 10 years of age shall be free when they arrive at the age of 25 years. And all slaves over 10 and under 25 shall be free when they arrive at the age of 25. And no slave shall be permitted to come into the state for permanent residence therein." Well, as you can imagine, there was a lot of discussion about this, but it was accepted as part of the statehood bill, and the U.S. Senate approved it on July 14th, 1862, by a vote of 23 approved and 17 against, but there were 8 abstentions. It took the U.S. House of Representatives a little longer to pass the bill, but they did approve it on December the 10th, 1862, by a vote of 96 in favor and 55 against. With congressional approval out of the way, the last step in gaining statehood was the signature of President Lincoln. The president's longtime friend from Illinois, Senator Orville Browning, delivered the bill to him. Browning noted at the time that his friend was, quote, "distressed at its passage, as he thought it was a sign of his own failure to attempt reconstruction in Virginia." The president sought advice and support from his cabinet, but Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles was immediately emphatic about his opposition, saying, quote, "This is no time to divide the old Commonwealth. The requirements of the Constitution are not complied with, as they in good faith should be." Attorney General Edward Bates and Postmaster General Blair joined Welles in opposing this bill. And that's strange because Edward Bates is the one who told him that this was the best way to do it. He explained in his thoughts, quote, "I give it as my opinion that the bill in question is unconstitutional and highly inexpedient. I persuade myself that Congress, upon maturer thought, will be glad to be relieved by a veto from the president and the evil consequences of such an improvident legislation." The Secretaries of State William Seward, Treasury Salmon Chase, and War Edward and Stanton offered their support of the bill and urged the president to sign it. President Lincoln realized the implications of a new state as he needed all the pro-union support possible. But he also realized that he would be allowing one portion of Virginia to secede from another portion, while at the same time saying that the secession of southern states was unconstitutional. On the last possible day of decision, December 31st, 1862, President Lincoln wrote in his opinion on the admission of West Virginia into the Union, which stated that aid of West Virginia in the current struggle, plus the fact that much of the soil of West Virginia was free from slavery, made it imperative to admit them to the Union. On the very next day, Lincoln officially signed into law the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in states of rebellion. One paragraph in that document exempted the 48 counties designated as West Virginia. And he did that because he knew they were working towards getting rid of the slaves. And he wanted to give them the time. Now, full statehood was only one step away from reality, and that is the citizens of West Virginia would have to approve the statehood bill because it had been changed a little bit in Congress. The election was set by March 26, 1863. To prepare for that election, the West Virginia Constitutional Convention was called back into session in February 1863 to approve the changes made by the Congress, especially the Willey Amendment. The convention unanimously approved these changes and submitted them to the citizens. The vote was held on March 26, 1863, and the new Constitution was overwhelmingly approved by a count of 27,749 for and 572 opposed. With the election in hand, President Lincoln sent a proclamation on April 20th, 1863, stating, quote, that West Virginia was now declared to be one of the states of the United States of America, and in pursuance of that act of Congress, I declare that the said act shall take and be enforced from and after 60 days from the date hereto. The 60-day waiting period was June 20th, 1863, the official date of admission to the Union and the state's official birthday. During the 60-day waiting period, Arthur I. Borman was nominated and selected to be the first governor of what would be the 35th state. The restored and reorganized government of Virginia, which still had Francis Pierpont as its governor, moved from Wheeling to Alexandria, Virginia, and continued to control the Union-held remaining portions of the Commonwealth. Pierpont ordered that the citizens of Jefferson and Berkeley would be allowed to vote for admission into West Virginia. With Union troops placed at all the polling places, both counties voted for inclusion in the new state. That vote also remains controversial today. This is the seal. Arthur L. Borman was sworn in on June 20th, 1863. In his remarks to the crowd gathered in Wheeling that day, he summed up the many years of struggle between Western and Eastern Virginia with the following words: West Virginia should long since have had a separate state existence. The East has always looked upon that portion of the state west of the mountains as a sort of outside appendage, a territory and state of pupillage. The unfairness and inequality of legislation is manifest in the legislature by the original constitution of the state and have clung to it with the utmost tenacity ever since. They have collected heavy taxes from us and have spent large sums in the construction of railroads and canals in the East, but have withheld appropriations from the West. They have refused to make any of the modern improvements by which trade and travel could be carried on from one section to the other, thus treating us as strangers. Our people could not get to the capital of their state by any of the usual modes of travel without going through the state of Maryland and the District of Columbia. The East and West have always been two people. Now that's how he got to this position. Let's see if it's legal. Here's the Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1 in the Constitution. States may be admitted by the Congress into this union. And this is the black darkened, it's my emphasis. But no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of an existing state, semicolon, nor any state be formed by the junction of two or more states or parts of states, comma, without the consent of the legislature of the states concerned as well of the Congress. The legal argument has always factored in the semicolon as opposed to the comma that should be there. Now, some historians and legal scholars have contended that West Virginia was formed illegally. The general question has never been adjudicated by the U.S. Supreme Court. However, the court has resolved a specific issue related to the form of West Virginia. On December 5th, 1865, the restored pro-Confederate Virginia General Assembly met in Richmond and passed legislation repealing all of the acts of the restored and reorganized government regarding the secession of the original the original counties, and the admission of Berkeley and Jefferson to the state. On March 10th, 1866, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution acknowledging the transfer of Berkeley and Jefferson to West Virginia from Virginia. Virginia sued and argued that no action had taken place under the Act of May 13th, 1862, requiring elections, and that the elections which occurred in 1863 were fraudulent and irregular. That's because they had Union troops at all of the polling places. West Virginia filed an objection that says the facts are correct, but the point is irrelevant and invalid, which alleged that the U.S. Supreme Court lacked jurisdiction over the case because it was a purely political nature. Does this all sound familiar? When the state of Virginia versus state of West Virginia first came to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1867, there were only 8 justices on the bench due to the death of Justice James Moore Wayne. For this reason, Chief Justice Salmon Chase delayed taking up the case until the court had its full complement of 9 justices. He did this because he did not want a tie vote, and he was hoping for a new justice that would vote on the side of the Chief Justice. This scenario did not happen until March of 1870. The acceptance of the original jurisdiction in this matter is now considered one of the most significant jurisdictional cases in the Supreme Court's history. Another unusual occurrence in the case is the fact that the lawyer for the pro-Confederate restored government of Virginia was a former Supreme Court justice himself, Benjamin Roberts Curtis. The court decided that the objection from West Virginia could not be granted because the court had already established precedent in deciding several cases involving one state against another. The case then boiled down to the answer for 3 questions. Question 1, did the state of Virginia ever give consent? Question 2, did the Congress give such consent as rendered the agreement valid? And question 3, if both of the first 2 answers are yes, it would be necessary to inquire whether the circumstances alleged in this bill authorized Virginia to withdraw her consent. The court issued its ruling on March 6, 1871, denying Virginia's claim by a vote of 6-3. The majority opinion was written by Associate Justice Samuel Freeman Miller, and he was joined in the majority vote by Justices Salmon Chase, Samuel Nelson, Noah Hines Swing, William Strong, and Joseph Bradley. The majority found that the answers to the first 2 questions were yes, the state gave consent, and the Congress gave consent. To the 3rd question, could Virginia withdraw its consent? Justice Miller wrote, quote, she, Virginia, must be bound by what she's done. She can have no right years after all of this has been settled to come to a court of chancery to charge that her own conduct has been a wrong and a fraud, that her own subordinate agents had misled her governor, and that her solemn act transferring these counties be set aside against the will of the state of West Virginia and without consulting the wishes of the people of those counties. So this ruling established an implied consent standard, which has been used in similar cases today. Associate Justice David Davis wrote the dissent, joined by Justices Nathan Clifford and Stephen Johnson Field. These justices concluded that the Congress gave its consent to transfer these 2 counties after the restored pro-Confederate government of Virginia had repealed that consent. Although the Supreme Court has never ruled on the constitutionality of the state's original creation, such as those in the state of Virginia versus the state of West Virginia, has led to the de facto recognition of the state, which is now considered unassailable. If the Supreme Court would find that West Virginia was created unconstitutionally, they would have to also find that the states of Kentucky and Maine and possibly Vermont were also created unconstitutionally. The question would hinge on the first and second semicolons in Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1 of the United States Constitution. Now, the aftermath of statehood from June of 61 through April of 65, the state of Virginia had two governments operating simultaneously, one in Richmond as part of the Confederate States and the other in Wheeling and then later in Alexandria as part of the United States. This was not unusual. And as I've already said, that Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee had the same thing, the same situation. The right to choose the government to accept the United States Congress is in the hands of the US Congress. And so here stands the Capitol with the dome, the Golden Dome in Charleston, right along the Kanawha River. I'd be open to any questions. I think, Bob, you're going to do it through the chat.
Correct. If anybody has any, I don't see any in the chat room. So if you have questions, unmute yourself and ask.
I'm going to take down my share. Okay.
Is everybody awake?
Any? No questions? I covered that detailed.
That was a great presentation, Bob.
Hey, Bob, I do have a question. This is Craig Raines. Is that okay?
Okay.
The original issue on slavery said that there could be no slaves brought into the state, and no free person of color would be permitted to permanently live in the state. Was that second part ever done away with?
Yes. After the Civil War, the West Virginia government passed some very draconian laws, one of which said that ex-Confederates could not come into the state. And shortly thereafter, they were told by the federal government that you can't do that. And so they took the law out, and they also took the law out about Black individuals moving into the state. So it was something that was only in effect for a couple of years. But the first election after the war was over, pro-Confederates were not even allowed in the state to vote.
Thank you.
Bob,
Yes.
I have a question. In regards to the age of 25 being freed in West Virginia, genealogy has taught us that there were no birth certificates. How would they determine someone's age, a slave's age? Like today, so many teenagers are fully adult looking. And so how do they determine that?
Well, those numbers were on the census. So when you look at the 1860 census, if somebody owned slaves, they would put generally only a first name like Sarah, age 21. And then they would estimate the value of that person. So that the record comes from the 1860 census as to when somebody would be age 25 if they don't have a birth certificate.
So the slave owner was the one who determined the age, but
Right.
he might have gotten that person from someone else, from another slave owner, or from out of state prior to that ruling. And so there's no way to truly determine the age. So I was just kind of curious. Yeah. Unless they were born on the property, he could determine the age.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was not a very pure process. On the chat, Bob, have you got people on the chat thing? I see things popping up here. Oh, here it is up here.
Yeah. There's a question from Jack Fend. What led to the choice of Charleston as the capital, and what other locations were suggested?
Well, originally Wheeling was suggested, and that's where the capital it was in 1870. But it was at the far end of the north end of the state, and so they wanted it somewhere central. And it was moved to Charleston in 1875. And then it was moved back to Wheeling for a 10-year period while they built the actual capital. So then that was Wheeling and Charleston were the only two that were decided upon. The original state constitution rewritten was ratified by the people, and it has never been changed except by amendments. And that's very, very unusual. Let's see.
Hey, Bob, this is Rich Trost. Thanks for the history lessons of going back through the named areas within Morgantown. I'd forgotten how the buildings and principal architecture in that city had been renamed.
Yes.
It's 40 years ago, as I was there as a student.
I when I lived there on Willie Street, I had no idea who Mr. Willie was. And so that's one of the things that generated my interest. I said, well, who is this guy and what did he do? And then
I've never known who Borman was till today.
Yeah, all the other streets were named after other people too, except for High Street, which is I think
we won't go into High Street. That's private among us.
Yeah, that's the steepest street I ever drove on. Almost
Yeah.
perpendicular.
Yep.
Anything else there? I think also what I get, there's a lot of things that we hear about today now when we're talking about the constitutionality of something that was in the same questions that they faced in this statehood thing. So I think it's really good to look back on history and see where a lot of this stuff starts. Okay.
I've got a question. You've done a good job of presenting what happens when a portion of a state breaks off, but we're faced with DC and Puerto Rico, I believe, wanting to become a state. Have you done constitutional evaluation of what is necessary for them?
Well, that's much easier because they're not within the boundary of another state. So it's just a matter of whether their legislatures vote to approve it and send a bill for statehood to the U.S. Congress. And then the U.S. Congress has no other state they have to worry about because it's not coming out of a current state. Much simpler process.
Thank you.
Okay, is that about it?
I think so. Thank you very much, Bob, for a very interesting educational program.
Great presentation, Bob. Joe Okus.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, Bob.
Very well researched and presented.
This is
Thank
not
you.
the first time, of course, that Bob Stone has presented to us, and I hope it will not be the last.
Well, you all have already heard the 4 presentations that I have already fixed up. So I'm trying to find another subject. The one I had in February of 2020 was the notable women of the Civil War era. And I did that one specifically because 2020 was the year of the woman. So that one's sort of out of date now. But
Well, if you want to use us as guinea pigs, go ahead.
Right, okay. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, everyone, for coming to our session today. And please visit our website to keep knowledgeable about what we're doing. We will continue to send out occasional emails about things of interest, like our February meeting specifically, when we learn who the speaker is and what the topic is. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day. Thank you, Bob Johnson.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, gentlemen and ladies.
That was great. That really was great.